In part 1 of this series, we closed by talking about internal evidence of attribution, what a book says about itself in terms of who wrote it. Well, you can probably guess what this test is all about. Yep, it's what other people say about who wrote a book. Take Case for Christ. There's all kinds of people who will say Lee Strobel wrote this book. His editors, professional book reviewers, his wife and kids, even other apologists like me. All of those amount to external evidence that Lee Strobel wrote his book. And of course, there's no one out there who says it was written by Elmo Thudpucker. Pretty simple. Now when it gets to the Annals of Tacitus, things are a little more complicated. The Annals were probably published in 116 AD. The first mention we have of Tacitus writing anything by name comes from the 3rd century, between 200 and 300 AD. A Christian writer named Tertullian gives Tacitus credit not for the Annals, but for his other historical work, the Histories. This is the first direct attribution we have of something to Tacitus, and it's over 100 years later. Tertullian also cited Tacitus in 2 other places, and as the years pass, there are a number of signs that different writers knew of Tacitus or read his work, but we don't get a clear indication that he wrote the Annals from any of those. It's much later before anyone says anything to show that Tacitus wrote the Annals. That only happens when the Church Father Jerome, who lived between 340 and 420 AD, refers to 30 books of history by Tacitus. The Annals and the Histories comprise 30 books together, so it's pretty clear he means the Annals. Keep all of this in mind again when we start to look at the books of the New Testament. Now before we let this one go, there is a caveat when it comes to this test. Someone's testimony as to who wrote a book isn't much good unless they're in a position to know who wrote it. So, for example, while one of Lee Strobel's editors would be in a good position to know whether or not he wrote Case for Christ, some other people, well, they wouldn't be such good sources for that information. Hey, did you hear that Lee Strobel has a new book coming out? Actually, I just made this one up. But it's a good way to illustrate our next test, internal evidence of content. Basically, a test based on whether what's in a book matches with what we know about the author. There's 2 aspects to this. One subjective, one objective. My gag here with Lee Strobel illustrates the subjective test, which has to do with things like writing style, or the way an author presents their material. It might be said, for example, that this book couldn't possibly be by Strobel, because it doesn't sound like the way he writes. Or maybe that he doesn't write horror fiction for children. Points like that deserve consideration, but they also can't be given more weight than they deserve, because they put writers in a box under the assumption that the author could possibly be very versatile. There's plenty of examples that could be given of why that won't work, even with me. You see, I write a lot of books and articles on very serious subjects, with a lot of footnotes and academic references sometimes. But on the other hand, I also do this. Yep, in case you didn't know, all this art in these videos is mine. And I have my own webcomics too. The Annals of HEARTHSTONE, as opposed to the Annals of Tacitus, I guess. Now for the objective test. For this one, we'll use Tacitus again. The Annals are about events in the 1st century AD. So let's put it this way. If we read in the Annals that Emperor Nero opened a refrigerator, took out a burrito, and stuck it in the microwave oven, we certainly have some cause to doubt that a 2nd century author like Tacitus was responsible. What these amount to are what we call anachronisms. Things are out of place in a text because they reflect things past an author's time. So that's a sum of tests of internal evidence of content. Before we go, I'll just mention that it's this test more than any other that is used to doubt the authorship of New Testament books. But we'll talk more about that next time.